So welcome, everybody. I know some are still filing in, and it's great to see so many friends and people like Bill Galston, Patrick Chamarel from our editorial board, and Mike Fox, co-chair of our Circle of Friends of American Purpose, and David Kramer, and good heavens, too many to name by name, but welcome to all of you. I think it's a tribute to the subject at hand and our guests of honor that at the end of July, we have almost 70 people registered of extraordinary quality and intellectual diversity, age and gender diversity. What a fantastic mix. At the very end, when we wrap up, I'll invite you all to switch on your cameras and say hi. That'll come later. If you're, I don't know, if you're not at the beach with a pina colada in your hand or something like that, but just so we can connect a little bit to one another, or at least as best we can. But now to the matter at hand. My name is Jeff Gedman. I'm with American Purpose, and warmest welcome to all of you. This program has to do with the following: a splendid article written by John Ikenberry and Dan Deudney about 3 weeks ago. Don't hold me to the date, but it was in Foreign Policy magazine. It was on the roots of the or Biden foreign policy. I'm delighted to meet Dan for the first time today and see John Ikenberry, who is a member of our editorial board too, along with our moderator, Carla Robbins. If I may just plug at the top, John, your recent book, well, I can't keep up. You probably have one since. But anyway, there's a 2020 book called Making the World or World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism, the Crises of Global Order. Is that your most recent book, or did you squeeze another one in the last 9 months?
No, that's it. That's it. That's came out last October.
Okay, so great. And again, congratulations. And Michelle, if you could put that in chat, and please buy it and read it. I have read it and it is splendid. And Dan, you have your recent book, Dark Skies. Dan's recent book is Dark Skies. I won't even try to, by memory, read the whole title or subtitle. Could you give it to us, Dan?
Yeah, it's Dark Skies, and the subtitle is Space Expansionism, Planetary Geopolitics, and the Ends of Humanity. And I promise not to say anything about that here today.
But you would be welcome to, and thank you and congratulations, Dan. So Michelle would be good enough to put that in chat too, so people see it in writing. Thank you, Michelle. Carla Robbins is a friend of American Purpose. She's a guiding light. She's, as I said, an editorial board member. She's at the Council on Foreign Relations. She teaches. She's been with the New York Times. She's been with the Wall Street Journal in editorial and news capacities. Carla, you've kindly consented to moderate, lead, manage the conversation today, turning principally on the article published by these two gentlemen in Foreign Policy about 3 weeks ago. And Carla and I have agreed that the first half roughly would be you asking questions to John and Dan. The second half roughly would be open to the gallery, at which point Carla will continue as moderator and you can put questions in chat or you can raise your hand. Carla, sound okay?
Sounds great to me.
Great, we're off and running, and thank you all. And Carla Robbins, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Jeff, so much. And thank you, Michelle. I'm always very nice to Michelle because she edits my copy, but I also like her. And thank you so much, Professor Ikenberry and Professor Deudney. Can I call you by your first names? Great, thank you. So you all know who they are. They are both major political thinkers, and they think about political theory. They think about IR theory, something which always confounded me. And they think about real world politics, which is a very important thing. In addition to Professor Deudney's book about space, he is the author of Bounding Power, Republican Security Theory from the Polis to the Global Village. I just wanted to get into the fact that I know how to pronounce Polis. So their piece in FP, the Intellectual Foundations of the Biden Revolution, in which you write something that, I thought was very puzzling to me on two levels. But first, I want to read what you wrote about Biden. Like its earlier Rooseveltian 20th century model, the Biden program links domestic renewal with a new international agenda. Biden's focus is on decaying foundations, physical and political, at home and abroad, and on rebuilding them to deal with central emerging problems. With federal investments in infrastructure, education, and research and development, Biden's domestic renewal program serves his international goal of rapid decarbonization of the world's economy. Like Roosevelt's model, the Biden strategy aims to reverse a rising global illiberal and autocratic tide by deepening and modernizing liberal democracy. With this agenda, the Biden administration has staked out a bold program to extend and refurbish the liberal state and reestablish global internationalist leadership in problem solving. In effect, Biden seeks to show that not only is America still America, but it's ready to do again what it has successfully done before. It's a very strong, as we journalists like to say, nut graph. So it's a very strong assertion on two levels. And I think I'll start with the IR theory one to begin, because I can tell you Ernie Haas never taught me about Rooseveltian internationalism. Why have we never thought about that school of thought in that way? What makes it different from Wilsonianism, for example, and other forms of liberal internationalism? I think we really need that frame to start before we start thinking about whether it fits with Biden. I mean, everybody talks about Biden's domestic agenda in FDR terms, but what is this Rooseveltian idea? And how come you guys are the first ones to really write about it in that way? Jump ball, John, Dan, who'd like to go first?
I'll jump in, and then Dan can take up after me. Thank you, Carla, Jeff, Michelle. It's great to be here. It was a year ago I was here when I was introducing my book, A World Safe for Democracy. And in many ways, this question takes up the thread that goes back a year to that conversation. But what Dan and I are trying to do is make an intervention in the way we think about the tradition of liberal internationalism, the long tradition of liberal democracies building world order. And as you say, Carla, the kind of way in which the received wisdom thinks about liberal internationalism really goes back to Wilson and to 1919, the League of Nations, this vision of Wilson. And in many ways, what we're trying to do is say that actually that's wrong, that the revolution in American thinking about how liberal democracies should operate and can operate in the world, and the kind of great successes that they've achieved under the auspices of that banner of liberal internationalism really begins with Roosevelt. So we're trying to, as I tried to do in my book, decenter liberal internationalism away from Wilson. There's this kind of tradition of thinking about schools of thought in American foreign policy. Walter Russell Mead is famous for attaching a president to each of them, and the last president to get a name attached to an American tradition is Wilson. And that's odd. That's 100 years ago. The kind of the modern era really hadn't fully crested. And so in many ways, we are trying to say that there is this American tradition. It's Rooseveltian. In what way is it different from Wilson? I think I'll mention two, and then Dan might mention a third. I think Wilson was putting together the project of liberal internationalism, building himself on 19th century traditions at a time when liberal democracy was on the march. In 1920, the world looked like that was the direction. And in many ways, what Wilson was trying to do was leverage the world historical advance of liberal democracy to make a better world order. And it was really in the 1930s and 40s when Roosevelt was in some sense looking at the world with very different circumstances. Liberal democracy was on the ropes. And in many ways, what we argue is that Roosevelt saw an international order as important as the glue to hold liberal democracies together. Liberal democracy was very much kind of at an extinction moment, and the Roosevelt vision was to create a kind of container, a kind of full functioning, full service international order that would allow the fragile and retreating liberal democracies to rebuild themselves. And indeed, that's the great story of 1945 and its aftermath. So in important ways, FDR is liberalism and liberal internationalism for hard times, while Wilson was liberal internationalism for kind of more halcyon times. The second way in which Roosevelt really was revolutionary was that Wilson thought that the international order would, in some sense, be organized and maintained and rules and institutions enforced by the force of public opinion, backed by international law. And by the 1930s and 40s, liberal internationalists didn't believe that anymore, not least FDR. And what really the generation of FDR moved towards was building, once again, a container, a liberal international order, an ecosystem, an environment, a geopolitical environment, so that liberal democracies would have a kind of workspace for those countries to reweave their relationships, to create new capacities, so that liberal democracies in a new era, when the liberal state was evolving rapidly from the 30s and 40s, a new way in which these states could operate and create a kind of, as I said before, a kind of mutual aid society, so that those states that join in that order could get benefits from it. But importantly, in joining that order, would buy into a suite of responsibilities and obligations, a kind of logic of conditionality. And this is my punchline. The Biden administration has set upon it as a task of it, set upon the task of rebuilding a kind of club of democracies, a kind of community of like-minded states that would, together with shared social purposes, build an international order or rebuild one on the fragments that are there today. And what we're suggesting is that was Roosevelt's vision as well. And it was built around a logic of conditionality, not that this is the liberal order everybody can join, but that to be inside of it would be to take on these responsibilities and to have a kind of critical mass of states that could drive the agenda of reform internationally. So I'll turn things over to Dan, but Biden, in our view, and we'll get to this later on, I think is in important respects attempting to build on, to reconstruct that Rooseveltian tradition, and that's where we take up our paper.
Before Dan jumps in, and maybe Dan can develop this, but when you say an ecosystem, a geopolitical environment, I thought you were actually, we're going to be talking about institutions. So can you just explain what you mean by, or maybe Dan can explain what you mean by an ecosystem or a geopolitical environment?
Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, well, essentially those are the same things. Just general terms for an international context in terms of the other human societies in the world and how we are interacting with them. So let me go back to your question of why no one has seen this, and then say some more points about why Biden and FDR have this deeper affinity. Why has no one seen this? Well, there's an intellectual sociology. I mean, if Walter Russell Mead had had an extra cup of coffee that day, he might well have stuck it in, but the larger story here is what's happened in this country since the Reagan Revolution. The status of Franklin Roosevelt and everything associated with him has been, for the Republican Party, something that they want to a first approximation, down to the detail, get rid of. Empowerment of labor unions, progressive taxation of capital and income in estates, the regulatory state, in all of its different manifestations. So FDR is for the domestic political coalition that has been essentially hegemonic since around 1980. He is the foil. And the Democrats have been, kind of like Eisenhower was for the Republicans in the 50s, a sort of Reaganism with a human face, and not really in a position to lay out an alternative. So second, let's go back to this question of the FDR Biden link. John has laid out some of the key points, and a couple of other ones are that Biden and FDR are linked together in our view because of the similarities in the magnitude and the character of the problems that they say have to be dealt with. And of course, in the case of Roosevelt, it was the New Deal and the rise of radical anti-liberal, regimes, communist, fascist, that were gobbling up much of the world. Those were regime survival, types of problems. If we couldn't have solved the Great Depression to some approximation, liberal democracy in the United States wouldn't probably have survived. We forget how powerful the alternatives, particularly on the right, but somewhat on the left too, were at that time. And of course, with the world, the Second World War, it wasn't inevitable that we were going to win. We were in a good position, but it was a contest for the world. And so what is Biden saying that's at all analogous in the magnitude here and the character? And he's done two things, everyone I think would agree. First, planetary emergency, climate change. That this is something that has always been on the Democratic progressive, agenda, and often even the Republicans since the 1960s. But he has put it into the first tier and said that this has now got to be the organizing principle. And I won't go into why this is a good idea, except to say that last time the planet was this warm, the ocean was 54 feet higher. And so it's really not a question of whether we're going to save Miami. It's a question of whether we're going to save Orlando. That this is something that is going to undermine the foundations of everything as it's currently configured. And Biden and the people around him seem to get this, and hence the emphasis on infrastructure, a domestic change to help solve this planetary problem. Right? The second feature of the similarity here that we'd want to emphasize is that we now are at the beginnings, it appears, of a new round in what John and I refer to as the great contest for the world. Throughout the 20th century, and even before, of course, liberal democracy was not nearly as salient within the human community as it's been since the Second World War. We tend to forget this, and that there are not just laggards, but there are radical enemies, alternative paths to modernity on both the right, fascism and authoritarianism, and on the left. And Biden is saying, and I think that there's good case for this, that China poses a new version of this contest. They've married capitalism with something that's radically anti-liberal and democratic, and that they are a modernized version of autarky, of autocracy, and that everywhere in the world, like in the 1930s and like in the 1950s and 60s, the domestic character of countries is in play. Will they be mini Chinas using cyber surveillance and concentration camps, or will they be liberal democracies? And Biden, like Roosevelt, recognizes that the survival of liberal democracy in this country doesn't just hinge on what we do here, but hinges on the outcome of this contest globally. And that the most important thing that we can do, and this is really, the punchline again, which is to show that democracy works, to make democracy appealing because it deals with these problems that are important and that everyone faces, but also to show that democracy is an appealing domestic regime form because it satisfies the wants and aspirations of the large majority of people. And so it's an American faith. And it's basically a declaration that this American creed, modernized in the 20th century, remains really crucial now for reasons that we all need to be alarmed about and aware of and active on.
So I want to believe, okay? And certainly I think that Biden gets the fundamental. Listen, I'm the sort of person who used to get sort of teary-eyed every time I went to NATO headquarters, okay? So, I love the idea of Europe whole and free. I really do love all of these things, okay? I do really believe, hey, I'm an editorial writer. I believe in the perfectibility of man. And I think Biden gets a lot of these things. And I think that you guys have made a very compelling argument. And it's not surprising given his age that he would get some of these things as well, given when he grew up. And we've all gone through this trauma of Trump and watching him tear up so many things that are so dear and so fundamental to this world and that were so fundamental to creating the prosperity of the 20th century and the peace of the 20th century. That said, one thing is theory, another is practice. And now I'm going to be the journalist rather than the IR trained political scientist. What in the first 6 months of Biden presidency, separate from rhetoric, rises to the level of ambition in international affairs that merits this analogy? And because, I'm sort of depressed. I understand that he's paralyzed in many ways on the things he can do domestically, but he is proactively, a word I never use in print, he's retreating in Afghanistan. He's not pushing the Russians particularly hard. There's lots of things I can criticize him for as well. They seem sort of small ball. And I don't see the big transcendent things happening beyond the rhetoric and the vision.
Well, that's it's a good question. I see more, and maybe Dan can speak to this as well. But I think rhetoric matters, and a kind of reconstruction of the grand strategy, of the sort of articulation of the purposes and the defense of the American approach to world order, simply reversing a series of Trump calamities, it seems to me, rejoining Paris, bringing climate change. Again, Congress has a lot to say on all these issues and may have the final word, and we are just 3.5 years away from an election, so everything you say may be true, but the laying the ground for a return to the American playbook of the last 75 years, reaffirming NATO. I took some heart from the Atlantic Charter 2.0 that Biden and Johnson issued. I think that wasn't just simply theater. I think there was an intellectual component to that. It's sending messages to the world. I think recalculation of both friends and adversaries alike about what America is. It doesn't have to always be intervening and applying force. Indeed, to some extent, the recalibration in the Middle East is precisely what you would want to do if you are trying to restructure American grand strategy to a coming long war or long Cold War with China. Extraordinary efforts to rebuild R&D, education, structuring, and a kind of underlying Rooseveltian sense that in the final analysis, the American position 20 years from now will have a lot to do with whether our democracy works in solving problems, not necessarily in projecting force or power, but in solving problems. Democracy as a problem solver for 21st century problems, modernity problems, and that's where his bet is, I think. And so it's hard to say, all the, to register a group of successes, but kind of the positioning, it seems to me very important. Dan?
Can before Dan answers, and can I just follow up here just to give some, because you've raised a question and maybe Dan can address this in his response in part, which is, yes, Roosevelt had vision, and yes, Roosevelt had leadership and saw this, but this was backed up, by the fact that we won the war, which was force-based, and we were the only country standing with this massive military and this massive military industrial complex that had created this massive military and made it possible not only for us, but for Europe to fight the war. And we have all of these allies who are so fundamental to this ecosystem, as you refer to, and Dan said, that defines us as differently from other people, who are very doubtful, not just because of Trump, but also because of the retreat that Obama presided over as well. If you have people hanging from the struts of helicopters in Kabul, even though I agree with you that it's very hard to do the big things if we're pinned down in the little things, how is it possible to, reassure people that we're really, really back? I do think that force is a hallmark of the Rooseveltian triumph of American leadership, and a lot of people are afraid that the U.S. is not a particularly reliable ally or partner. And I wonder about how Biden is going to handle that as he does this larger Atlantic Charter rebuilding. Dan, sorry.
Well, you've raised some very important questions. In terms of picking up on what John said about why rhetoric matters, leadership is involved in the creation and the maintenance of narratives. And one of the reasons Reagan was so effective is, he told stories, and he told a story about who we were and about what we had done and about, how we went about doing things. And that level of narrative is something that the left of center has not had really in quite a while. There's a pessimism, there's an anti-Americanism, and part of our effort here in this piece and several others, and hopefully a book, is to provide a usable past for the current and next phase of American progressive liberal democracy. Second point, there's no comparison between Biden and Roosevelt with regard to what they've done in the first 6 months, right? There has been no 100 days here, all right? And it's a yawning gap of difference. And it may very well be that Biden will not be able to do very much in terms of implementing what he's laid out, right? But he has laid out a program in multiple areas that if he can't do it, then the next step is going to be to get a domestic coalition to provide the basis for doing it. And so there is a political conflict here. There's a political struggle. And climate change is not that something that you can just decide on the basis of policy preferences to do, because it touches on so much. And it's got all these powerful interests mobilizing on behalf of doing nothing. And similarly with regard to voting and democracy, with taxation, the restoration of progressive taxation, all of these, they're multiple fronts, and it's trench warfare, and the other side is dug in with heavy artillery. And so there is a domestic struggle. And it may well be, we have to acknowledge this, that the United States will not be able to get its stuff together here, right? It may well be that the sort of dysfunctions that we've increasingly experienced, will become the new normal, and that the partisan divisions, will become regime threatening. I guess in January 6th, some would say we've already crossed that threshold. But this is another way of saying that people who believe in the American creed and people who understand the contemporary world need to get galvanized and need to have to claim the flag, to claim our history, to claim our national interest, to claim our national survival, because they all are at stake. And this is the best path to actually realize those ends.
Well, amen. And I certainly hope some of those articles that you'll be writing for Jeff and Michelle, because it's certainly the creed around here. I think John raised, and exactly what Dan was talking about as well. As a journalist, of course, is my job to be contrarian. So that's why I'm asking questions. It's not that I don't agree with you guys. But the Boris Johnson thing is a very interesting moment here. Boris Johnson he's a nihilist. He's a disruptor. He breaks crockery without having any idea how to put it back together. So this Atlantic Charter thing was a very interesting 2.0 was a very interesting moment. It would suggest to me that either he's got somebody behind him who gets it, or maybe there is some yearning there, or maybe he just feels really alone since Brexit, and he's really happy that anybody was willing to stand next to him. But I believe that there is a yearning still out there. So the question becomes, because the conventional wisdom, of course, is that people are skeptical that the US really is willing to play. Do you find that in the people you talk to, when you make this argument out there, people in Europe, policy people who write about theory, that they are willing to buy into the notion of American leadership again, that they are galvanized by this vision that Biden has out there? Because interestingly, even within the US military, people were horrified by what Trump was saying. They got the notion, the value of what was created in the late 20th century, and they had a great deal of yearning for it, for American leadership again, and not militarism, but the notion of alliances and leadership. So are you picking up on this in Europe and in other parts of the world?
Yes, I certainly am. And you can look at some numbers. Pew has done some interesting surveys and shown that in Europe and in Asia, importantly, in Korea, for example, the numbers are extraordinary in terms of US as a leader. Favorable views of the US are up to 70% in Korea, South Korea, and 60 some in Japan. A sense that they're glad the US is rediscovering its leadership role. I think many of my friends in Europe and Asia, are still skeptical at a certain level, and they should rightly be. If you're a strategist in Berlin or London or Paris or Seoul or Tokyo, you would do what international relations scholars call hedging. You would be trying to keep a plan B in the back pocket, but you are wishing the United States well in rediscovering its own self-interest, and defending and recalling, because memory fades and generations come and go, and we don't remember that we have had it pretty good for so many decades, that there's an accomplishment there. What's remembered when we talk about this word that actually, it turns out Dan and I used for the first time in a paper 20 years ago, liberal international order. When people hear that term and tie it to America, it's the 2008 financial crisis, it's the Iraq War, it's a sort of sense of failure or failure to make good on promises, promissory notes that didn't come back with funds, and yet the longer story is extraordinary. The post-war 75 years, Germany and Japan reconstructing a framework, an ecosystem, to use the term of the day, to create foundations. And this is what we don't often remember, for our countries, our industrial societies of the 30s and 40s, to make this transition from 19th century laissez-faire societies to modern social democracies in Germany and France and Britain, the US, elsewhere, each in its own way, making these transitions and creating this kind of framework of capacities, international capacities, to allow our governments to do more. There's a story there of creating security, generating prosperity, sharing the spoils of modernity widely. In fact, in some sense, more widely than maybe we should have. China got into the club without signing up to the suite of responsibilities. The club broke down, but I think part of the story, part of the task for people like Dan and me and many of the people on the screen today is to make the case. I think E.H. Carr said that part of what scholarship is to show a pathway that may not actually be traveled, but could be traveled. And that, I think, that usable past that Dan was talking about earlier is very much at the heart of our enterprise.
So let's go to, you made a very good point, and which is, we have many people on the screen who have very good questions to ask, and Dan, you can pick up with that or anything you want, which is that there are many questions coming in. I'm going to do Peter's question first, and Peter, I apologize, is it Beshkahazi? Did I do a reasonable job there?
Yes, thank you.
Yay me. Do you consider the EU, minus Hungary and Poland, a partner to the US in propping up liberal internationalism and combating climate change? I mean, is the EU the natural partner there? Does the EU actually have an ability to even, partner up there these days? And or are they so internally divided that and EU minus Merkel, I will add to this, is that capable to be the real interlocutor for this? Can I add something else to it, which is what question my students would ask, which is, and if the EU is our main interlocutor, aren't we sort of perpetuating this sort of global north, all white guy world?
Dan, why don't you go first? I've got a couple points, but if you want to,
Yes, obviously the EU has got to be part of the coalition, a central part. And John and I wrote about democratic internationalism a while back and pointed out that one of the features that's different about the world now from what it was in the early 1930s is that there are a lot more democracies, and a lot of them are quite capable. And finding the common ground and finding common purpose among these like-minded regimes, is an ongoing project that hasn't been given nearly as much attention as one would think. And then I will say something about this leadership and what it does, and the task of people like us. It can't just be people like us talking to people like us. One of the features that the right has been so successful, the anti-Reagan coalition, which has painted us into a corner and which has undone much of the legacy of the New Deal, and which is leaving us blind and stupid for dealing with these contemporary problems, they are masters at the outreach, the participatory events that have, kind of provincial, local, people that are drawn in, to the narrative. and see themselves as co-conspirators. Maybe that's not quite the word to use, but colleagues, comrades in arms.
Co-creators.
Yeah, and also back to this thing about Biden's success and got to deliver. He may not be able to, and Trump might be president again in a couple of years. We might not be able to do any of these things that he's laid out. We might have paralysis, and it might get worse before it gets better. But one reason that I am optimistic is that I think that things are on our side. And by things, I mean nature. That if people don't think climate change is true now, well, they're going to get a lesson. And when the West is burning up, et cetera, and it's very hopeful that the younger generation already is very, very centered on this problem. And so really, this is the next generation is going to, perhaps after things get worse, have the opportunity, hopefully, to still put us on the right track.
Carla, I would just say that the idea of building coalitions, it has to be a creative, inclusive exercise going on at different levels. And there are interesting things going on in East Asia that are not necessarily going to be connected to Europe. Some will be connected. The so-called D10, which has kind of interesting ideas about high capacity democracies, South Korea, Australia, different combinations. And if you kind of carefully read the history of the last 75 years, it was that way already. It wasn't simply US and Europe. There were always networks and groupings and G kind of configurations that played a role. And that's clearly going to be very important. But Europe and the EU, I think, is crucial. I think we have to wish Europe well, and in many ways they are a microcosm of the problem I was identifying earlier. The kind of the breakdown of the logic of conditionality. If Hungary and Poland can get away with what they're doing, then it really is subversive of EU in so many different ways, and sort of reestablishing that there are barriers to entry and there are obligations for entry, and that's true in a slightly more diffuse way globally. That is so important in the way in which we engage and confront China. So I think it is a kind of all-in kind of exercise.
As I say to my students, if the European Union had to desegregate the Arkansas schools, they would never be able to pull it off. The European Court of Justice, not be able to pull it off, which is frustrating if you would, in terms of alliances. On the other hand, they've got pretty good values for most of their countries. Bill Galston, our friend, has a question.
Hi, and thanks for a really interesting and challenging presentation. Let me introduce my own note of skepticism. I absolutely agree with the proposition that Biden, among other things, is trying to recenter American defense and foreign policy on the rising China threat. And I think the facts are on his side in that regard. And of course, the facts were on Trump's side in that regard as well. This is a continuation and not a radical break with the prior 4 years. I think those of us on the other side of the aisle have to acknowledge that. But my question is this: is this a Rooseveltian moment, or is it a Truman moment? Right? If you're really going to recenter American foreign policy on the rising threat from and the long-term competition with China, don't you have to do what Dean Acheson told Harry Truman to do, and that is, go out and scare the hell out of the American people? Don't you have to deliver the bad news to your own political base? That there's not only a narrative and values component to this struggle, but also a hard power component. Don't you have to reconsider the military budget and put it on a track that will enable us to be a credible military deterrent to China? Don't you have to listen to all of the generals and especially the admirals who are saying that if China invades Taiwan, we might well lose if we decide to oppose them? In other words, where is, recalling Walter Lippmann's definition of a solvent foreign policy, where is the solvency in this policy? Where is the meat?
Well, I don't disagree with you that the challenge, the China challenge, which I think you have to go back to the late Obama years. I mean, just track Kurt Campbell's arguments across the period, and you'll see that this is not even Trump. I would say that Trump was actually maybe got the idea right, but Biden has the strategy right, which is to a comprehensive strategy. And indeed, that was the Truman view, that the challenge of the Soviet Union was not narrowly a military one, although that was part of it, but it was a comprehensive struggle over how we organize our society. We were during that period doing all sorts of things that mattered hugely for the long term. In how we rebuilt our society after World War II, the investments we made, the allies, yes, are very important. Biden is rebuilding. The single most important thing he's done is put down the predicate that our allies are a fundamental importance to American national interest, full stop. And that's been registered. And I think despite Trump's efforts, he wasn't able to dislodge that American commitment. I guess that what makes it Rooseveltian, and Truman is very much building on it. I think if you kind of you see Truman more as building on as opposed to altering the Rooseveltian foundation. It's a broader kind of struggle. The struggle with China is going to be as much about technology and standards and critical mass. Who has the largest platforms? Who has authority over regulatory protocols? Where is the science taking place? So those are struggles that are echoes of that earlier period of the 40s and 50s. And it's not simply about military budgets.
Let me add one point here on this. Harry Truman is an understudy of Franklin Roosevelt. And we also should recognize that the situation, you say solvency, the military budget, the United States spends as much as what the next 12 countries or so combined. And saying that we might not be able to defend Taiwan, and therefore we need a larger defense budget, it is probably not right. It's that we need to spend it in different ways. But we also should recognize that the incapacity to regulate large capital weapon systems is a major part of the progressive agenda. And that in dealing with China, that it's not simply a matter of competing with them, it's also a matter of cooperating with them. And this is a even more difficult thing to do. We did it during the Cold War to some degree with the Soviet Union.
Boy, there's a lot there that I would love to go into, but I certainly want to talk a little bit about the question that David Kramer and Eric Chenoweth raises, which is Biden came in talking about a sum of democracies, and certainly the fundamental argument that you guys are making, which is what's at stake and what makes us so Rooseveltian, is this fight between democracy and autocracy, the fight between democracy and authoritarianism. And yes, Biden has said, not just to the world, but also to the American people, we're going to prove to you that democracy works because we have our own internal problems with authoritarianism. The authoritarian impulse is very strong inside this country right now in a really scary way. That said, as David and Eric have pointed out here, is that in the early months here now, in the recent months, that Biden has granted Putin an audience in Geneva, blessed Nord Stream 2, stumbled initially over the Cuban protests, but recovered. Welcomed the Saudi deputy defense minister and brother of MBS, went ahead with the usual military aid to Egypt. They may be our SOB, they may be SOBs, but there are SOBs. That sort of worked in the Cold War. But if this really is this moment in which we really believe that we have to prove, we don't have existential competitions out there. We're willing to let Afghanistan go, but at the same time, we're going to play footsie with the Saudis. I think there's some important symbolism here and some pretty big decisions we have to make to show our leadership on issues of democracy. Or are David, Eric, and I wrong on this one?
Well, look, the Biden administration can't change everything overnight. And we have all of these longstanding and complex relations with all these different countries. And starting to pump up the concern for democracy and human rights is something that this administration has done, but it hasn't revolutionized our relationship to the degree that it would if it were the sole factor that we were dealing with. And on this question, David Kramer, very interesting work here, this Summit for Democracy, my thought would be that doing this on an interstate basis is probably more problematic, require more capital to do than it might be worth. But maybe instead, this should be done at the level of political parties. And this is something actually that the Europeans ought to take the lead in. We talk about American leadership is back. Well, the Europeans already lead us in important ways in many different dimensions. And instead of telling them we're back and we're going to start leading again, I think we should say, you guys continue leading in this direction, continue leading in that direction. The United States can't do it all. And you guys are as wealthy, as numerous, as technologically advanced, and in some ways are better manifestations of this basic liberal creed than we are. So step up.
So we have 3 minutes left, and it's sort of final Jeopardy moment here. So I'm going to let you guys answer any question you want. That said, I'm going to throw something in here, which is we have a global pandemic. Biden has committed to doing something. We'll see how quickly that vaccine gets out there. But isn't the difference between Roosevelt's moment and the 21st century that we have to worry about the global South, that we have to do a hell of a lot more? And hasn't that pandemic shown that at a period of time, we can't afford to ignore the rest of the world? We see what's happening. We are all incredibly, as you said, technology is so incredibly important in interdependence right now. There is really no difference between, we see what's going on in the global South. Is Biden committing in any way to do this? And can he provide this leadership and this vision of democracy without doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just say that Roosevelt, first on this kind of the earlier question about sort of retrograde countries, Biden still engaged in them. That's very Rooseveltian. Rooseveltian cut corners and made tragic trade-offs in many, many ways. And indeed, there's a whole line of critique of Roosevelt for not being, not living up to his idealistic, four freedoms kind of image. Although I think the record shows he did pretty well on the long term. He was playing a long game. I do, and the other point about Roosevelt that Biden gets is this interdependence, that we are kind of in it together, including the global South will have a lot to say with whether we can get sustainable growth and a stable system for conducting our various relations. At the Bretton Woods conference, Roosevelt famously made the argument that that he used the word contagion, even that what goes on in other countries increasingly in this modern era can come back and bite you if you don't get it right. And so he was a real interdependence theorist, and I think in that sense he would be very much on board, as I think Biden probably is intellectually, that the pandemic is consigning a whole set of countries to great economic jeopardy. I mean, the kind of problems we're going to see in the out years here after the pandemic maybe gets under control. Although the idea of a permanent pandemic, that term I think is going to be one that pops up more and more. But South Africa, India, these are countries that used to be the BRICS. Remember that term? And so we really think we really have to talk much more about that. And I think that's kind of the last piece that probably Biden needs to bring in, that is not quite all there. But I just would emphasize the importance of it, and so I would just concede your point. Dan?
So it's 1 o'clock. Dan, you have one very quick last thought, and since we've left so much unsaid, clearly you need to talk to Jeff and Michelle about writing about it. So Dan, quickly, and then I'll turn it back to Jeff.
Oh, gee, I think John pretty much said it, but I do think that this interdependence problematique is central to the Rooseveltian, and it's central to obviously the climate change and the pandemic. And it's another instance in industrial modernity of dealing with externalities of our other activities and side effects of connections we've made for other reasons, posing major problems. And that if we can't get a handle on those sort of feedback loops from our other activities, it's a civilizational dysfunction that will be extremely costly.
Thank you. Jeff, back to you.
Unmute. So listen, thank you, all of you, for spending valuable time today. We know that you have many obligations and Zoom conversations. I would say, Carla, beautifully done. As always, Dan and John, thank you. Tip of hat. We like very much ideas and arguments being advanced, cogent ones. And to our colleague, Bill Galston, we like them tested and challenged and stretched. I thought this was stimulating and rich. I've been jotting down notes on my iPhone and jotting down notes on paper, and if you can even see all that. So I found it profitable in more ways than one. So this is the point where, for all of you, if you're in a position to do so, switch on your camera to say hi and bye to the colleagues in different cities and even different countries today. And so, Carla, thanks. And Dan and John, really well done. We're open and eager to host you anytime and publish you too. So thanks a million, and everybody have a great afternoon and evening, if it's evening your time.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Jeff, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know you have lots to do, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bravo. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.